Tarja's water. What is the next? Okay, so welcome to this roundtable on conceptualizing and theorizing peace. So I especially welcome our digital guests who are with us now on Zoom. My name is Jarstad and I will be chairing this session. We have a panel consisting of Peter Wallensteen, Paul Diehl, Tarja Väyrynen and Roger McGinty. And we will talk about what peace is and are there different dimensions of peace and how can different nuances and degrees and characteristics of peace be explained, and what is the way forward for peace research. So please note that this roundtable is live streamed and recorded. And if you have a question, you just use the raise hand function in the Zoom or write to Johanna in the chat. And for you in the room, you can of course raise your hand physically. So there will be, we'll let the speakers talk first, and then after that we will open up for comments and questions both on the floor and digitally. So we will start right away with Tarja Väyrynen. Please, go ahead.
Thank you. The title of my talk or round table talk is Dimensions of Peace, a View from Feminist New Materialism. And this is based on two issues or two thoughts. First of all, I've been intrigued by your work on the varieties of peace. I like the term and I've been thinking about it a lot, what it actually means. But then what I want to present here is a puzzle I have. And that is how to take into account also non-human dimensions of peace when theorizing and conceptualizing it. And I argue that we seldom consider non-human elements of peace, or we seldom include non-human when we theorize the varieties of peace. And in this talk, I will go in detail, a bit detail, to one case study, and that's an example of Ukraine and the Donbas region in Ukraine, to highlight the importance of also theorizing and conceptualizing the non-human, the environment. And as you know, and we know, for decades, Donbas has been one of the Ukraine's most polluted regions. And that's because toxic waste from nearly 2 centuries of intensive coal mining and chemical and metal industries has accumulated in its soils. And it's a region known for heavy industry. As I said, coal industry, machine building, metalworking, and things like that. And from the war 214 onwards, the situation has been getting worse. The kind of industrial infrastructure has been destroyed, largely destroyed. Environmental degradation has significantly increased, and also the fighting in the region has had direct mechanical and chemical impacts on the environment. and huge areas of ecosystems have been completely destroyed or damaged. And already in 2018, the UN Environment Programme noted that the Donbas region is an ecological catastrophe fueled by air, soil, and water pollution. And of course, that has had a direct effect on the Ukraine's population in terms of health, food supply, and livelihood. And of course, these risks are not limited to Ukraine. So this has transborder dimensions, including Russia, Belarus, Moldova, and larger parts of Eastern Europe. And one example of this transboundary nature of the catastrophe is the Donets River, which is the most polluted river in Ukraine, and which is a tributary of the Don River, which flows through the neighboring Russian Federation. And this pollution has caused huge health risks for the population living along the Don River, for whom the river is the main source of water. And of course, these environmental and public health risks have increased with Russia's invasion of Ukraine this year, February. I think something we might need to consider when we are theorizing the varieties of peace is the notion of slow violence presented by Rob Nixon. And of course, we might want to consider the idea that there is need for slow peace, or there is a need for theorizing peace in terms of environmental degradation. And I come back to the ontology of this later. I think Rob Nixon's notion of a slow violence captures a part of the catastrophe in the Donbas, since it acknowledges the vulnerability of ecosystems and of people who are already poor, disempowered, and often involuntarily displaced. Of course, in the Donbas region, slow violence has been unfolding for decades, but the war has made it worse. And what will follow, whatever type of peace is achieved in Ukraine and in the Donbas region, slow violence will be experienced over many years, and possibly even over generations. As I said, what variety of peace is reached in Ukraine, slow violence will remain. And as I said in the beginning of my talk, my question is, what is then the variety of peace, or rather practices of peace that follow slow violence, that kind of, not follow, but that tackles slow violence, and how to theorize and conceptualize this peace? And unfortunately, I have no answers to that. I want to point out that there is an emerging literature on environmental peace building, and environmental security has been a concept which has been discussed in peace and conflict studies. But I would like to argue that we actually would need alternative ontologies to tackle these type of violences I'm talking here now. And I would like to point to the direction of feminist new materialism to figure out alternative ontologies. And why it would be kind of important to look at these alternative ontologies and go to the direction of feminist new materialism. I think it's important here because that way of theorizing emphasizes and looks at the web of interlinkages co-constitutive entanglements between human and non-human, human and matter. And the argument is that both individuals and the environments are co-produced and they co-evolve in historically, and they are always highly diversified, locally specific, and the matter plays a role in this co-constitution. And feminist new materialism as a kind of theoretical thinking goes to the direction that it argues that matter, like minerals, water, they are not passive, but they are active, they have agency in relation to human. They are co-constituted and co-constitutive of human. And that is something, that's my puzzle, how to deal with this co-constitution of human and non-human when we are theorizing the varieties of peace. And I don't have an answer to this question, but I want to ask this type of question when we are discussing the varieties of peace. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Tarja. So we will listen to the next speaker, and then I will let each of you first speak, and then you can respond to each other's interventions before we open up the floor. So please, Paul.
Thank you. I'd like to focus on the traditional negative peace, positive peace distinction. Most people associate that with Johann Galtung, and even though there are similar ideas from Quincy Wright and others that predate that. And if you look at those kinds of ideas of negative peace and positive peace, you find first that Galtung's 1969 article laying out much of that has been cited over 10,000 times. And in fact, we could add thousands more to that total if you look at some related articles he had thereafter. There's no doubt that that distinction has had a major influence on research, and particularly the negative peace idea has dominated the discourse in both scholarly elements, note Gaddis's long peace idea, as well as the way policymakers talk about peace as well. Now, big ideas play an important role both in policymaking and in the way we conduct our research, but they also have the effect of narrowing discourse in research in the way we think about things. In effect, many of those big ideas have a path dependency effect that lead us in certain directions and therefore not in others. When I talk about that, I like to cite Morgenthau's idea of realism and what to look for, or something a little narrower on Louis Fry Richardson's arms race models. All those are tremendously influenced ideas. They move in certain directions, but they also make us miss other things or not think in different ways. So for the presentation today, I'd like to have a thought experiment. For a scholar, or something we might call it not a scholarly experiment, but a counterfactual. What if we started from scratch as if there was nothing before, and not from the beginning point of the negative positive peace distinction? What decisions would we have to make, and what might our conception of peace look like as a result of starting at the equivalent of terra nullis? First decision, first thing to think about, whose perspective are we looking at to define peace? For scholars, we get fancy terms, and that's the level of analysis, right? So what level of analysis would we have? Traditionally, in part because of that past work and the Cold War orientation that was there, is we focused on states, and it was very state-centric. But that's not the only option. One could look at peace from the perspective of the international system, the region, the state, the sub-state, the group, the local, or the individual. In many ways, as I've thought about this, anthropologists in many ways were way ahead of us as other kinds of social scientists, focusing often on societies or communities, however large or whatever characteristics those were. And it's only been in the last decade or more that we've started to see that kind of thinking start to permeate peace research. You can see some of those elements in Steven Pinker's work on peace, where he focuses a lot on individuals and cognitive psychology, to the so-called local turn in peace building studies, to the everyday peace indicators at more at the individual level that's reflected here today. We have to think on whose perspective and way we define it, an issue we've discussed already, whether it's relational or it's a fixed unit. The Varieties of Peace project, the work Gary Gertz and I have done, the work of Christian Davenport, Eric Melander, and Pat Regan also focus on that relational aspect. So what do we do when we have these kind of choices of levels of analysis and perspective? Well, one response to that is let hundreds of levels of analysis bloom, that all of them are good. And I think there's something to that, because when you select those levels of analysis from the individual to the local to the aggregated to the system, the normative, causal, and other elements don't necessarily match up. And even the conditions that are present, peaceful at one level and peaceful at the other, can be very kind of different. And so I think there are very interesting kind of different kinds of research questions, ideas, and things that can flow by looking at it from different kinds of perspectives of what I would call the stakeholders for that. And some of those most interesting questions is when you see those different levels of analysis take place, is how they influence one another. Second thing to consider in my thought experiment, would violent conflict still be at the centerpiece of our conceptions of peace if we hadn't started with a negative positive peace? The war, no war distinction, I don't care how you define it, dominates what we do. Would we start with that if we had to do it all over again? Would the absence or low levels of violence really be a prerequisite for other elements of peace or not? And can we have substantial violence along with other elements, things we associate with positive peace, however designed? When you start breaking out of that war, no war, negative, positive peace, there are other kinds of questions that we think about. Now, maybe we would go back to focusing on war or violent conflict as a prerequisite or a necessary conditions. Maybe we wouldn't, and maybe we shouldn't think that way. Third question, the one the most difficult, and you see a variety of answers at this workshop, what are the essential components of peace? For critical theorists and others, it's aspects of justice and human rights. Were this a room of economists, they might be talking about equity, equality, or minimum human needs. Among feminist theorists, it might be aspects of gender. Perhaps at a workshop nearby on democracy, it might be something about participation or democracy. Well, which is it? Is it all the above? Good idea to try and aggregate them. Here's my second shot of the day at the Global Peace Index. We really try and put them all together, or in looking at what the elements of peace, should we think not as peace as a holistic idea, but something that is merely a series of parts that maybe collectively is more than a sum of its parts, but therefore parts still exist or pieces that we really need to examine individually and likely to come up with different conclusions. So I often think it's useful, and particularly as I become an older scholar rather than a young whippersnapper anymore, to think about the intellectual history of a discipline and the development of scholarly pursuits. And sometimes I think we ought to look back and start to think about how did we get where we are, and is there a way to kind of go back to the beginning and rethink some of the things without losing all the insights that we got? Thank you.
Thank you very much. So now we will move to Peter Wallensteen's presentation.
With the PowerPoint presentation.
Jag kör med pilen här. Yeah, thank you very much. Very nice to follow Paul Diehl. When you were president of the International Studies Association, you actually made researching peace one of the themes of the whole association. And I think that was very much of an inspiration to many of us who are around the table here today. So thank you for doing that, and thank you for your earlier intervention. I would like to come back to the concept of quality peace, which I've been working on myself together with Madav Roshi, who is here, and other colleagues. But as you can see, my challenge is Ukraine. To me, what happened on the February 24th, 2022 was a shock. It was partly predictable, but partly not. But primarily, I think for us in peace research or involved in the developing the concept of peace, it's really the question of the interstate conflicts coming back in a way which we haven't seen and haven't been necessary to see for about 30 years. In 1991, Iraq's ambition to eliminate Kuwait as an existing and independent state led to a huge international reaction against that. You cannot demand that states give themselves up and integrate into other states, and you cannot change territory by force, territorial borders by force. And since then, there has been a common consensus which has made it possible to think about peace in terms of what happens within nations rather than between nations. And I think what is happening here is that the interstate dyad is back. It is really a return to things that we did exist earlier in peace research, looking at the security dilemma in various forms, the military one, of course, the insecurities that we can hear about every day on the news, basically so far taking place only in Ukraine, but that's so far. There is a nuclear threat, a use of a nuclear weapon, how small it might even be, will be an enormous threshold that is being passed. And diplomacy is not functioning. There was a minimal of preventive actions before the war broke out. Today, we are in a situation where there is basically no recognition between the parties. There is no mediation. There are no substantial talks between the parties. And indeed, we are constantly reminded about the human insecurity created by the targeting of civilians and the civilian activities and the amount of war crimes that we can see basically on television. And I think Tarja just added additional insecurities here for the climate. I think this will have and should have an important impact on how we conceive of peace. But I would also like to say, we have to ask the question, is this basically European affairs? I think this is more than something that happens in the region of Europe. It is actually challenging the thing that we have assumed, that there is a territorial sovereignty of existing states, and that makes peacemaking possible. But this invasion means that that is basically violated. And it, in that sense, violates a central and universal norm for how to solve conflicts. It has been that the state entities do exist and are supposed to continue to exist unless they by themselves would like to give it up. So in that sense, I think it is a challenge to a norm that has been permeated throughout the planet. We can also say that there is an empirical understanding here necessary as well, that big conflicts in Europe have a tendency to become universal. Europe is still too much in the center of the world, and I need not remind this audience about World War I and World War II. So I thought it would be interesting to just study how the world reacts to this particular event. And on March 2nd, 2022, there was a vote in the UN General Assembly. This is really the only part of the UN that has reacted in a substantial way to this conflict. The Security Council, of course, was blocked by the veto by Russia, and the UN Secretary General has been surprisingly inactive. I think there is much more space for him if he would like to act, but he hasn't. But the General Assembly took a resolution where one condemned Russia's actions as a question of aggression. And aggression is, of course, one of the three key terms to be used for mandatory action if the Security Council would like to act. And that was 141 states taking that out of a total of 193. In between, there are some 50 states that either were abstaining or were not present or voted against. And to my mind, they are interesting to scrutinize a little more to understand what is really going on here in the world and how the world reacts. The patterns are quite clear. European countries in the Pacific and in the Americas, more than 85% voted in favor of this aggression resolution, so to say. It was a different pattern when you look at the Middle East, the MENA region that we have discussed before in this conference. Africa and Asia, there was less than 75%. It was somewhere down to about 50. There's still a majority, you could say, but for me it's interesting to ask who is this minority, and is that something we need to pay attention to when we think about the concepts of peace? So the outcome is this table that I looked at it in terms of whether these states themselves were involved in territorial disputes in the past decade using the UCDP, Uppsala Conflict Data Program, or if they were not, in these three regions, the Middle East, Asia, and Africa. And what was coming out was actually something which is statistically significant, namely that those who voted in favor of condemning aggression on the whole did not have unsolved territorial disputes, but those who were against this in one of the forms that I mentioned were actually themselves involved in territorial disputes. I thought that was interesting and maybe worth a little further analysis. And that leads to my quick conclusions that countries not defining Russia's action as aggression were themselves involved in serious territorial disputes. China, India, Pakistan, Azerbaijan is just a few of them. And it strikes me then that when I look at these countries, on the whole, very strongly driven by a nationalist approach which is also a territorial nationalism. And they all have these kind of disputes with neighboring countries. And they don't see what Russia has been doing as aggression. They obviously see it as fairly legitimate. And that gives me a feeling that here is more countries challenging this basic understanding of the territorial integrity. That means that one of the pillars on which we have built conflict resolution is then threatened. And as we have said, peace is basically relational, but it is also interstate relational. Even a society building its own quality peace internally can be exposed to danger from its neighbors or neighbor. So my conclusion then is that if we are going to think about peace in the world after February 24, 2022, we need to integrate also the bilateral, regional, and global context to understand what a useful peace concept really should include. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. So we'll turn over then to Roger McGinty.
Okay.
Do you have your microphone? Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you, and very lovely to be in a room with other human beings. I wonder, have we had a peace-building moment that is, over the past 20 or 30 years, we have had the high point of peace building, and we're now in or moving rapidly towards an era in which realism is in the ascendant. I leave that as a question because I think with the fog produced by the war in and on Ukraine, possibly now isn't the time to have a definitive answer to that question, but it's a good question to ask, I think. Maybe we're in a 1930s moment. The parallels are quite frightening. We've got a rise of militarism. We've got the normalization of security. We've got the rise of populism, the mobility of capital and the uncertainty that brings. We have the clear failure of collective security organizations, as Peter has just mentioned. It's also worth thinking that in the 1930s, there was also a group of scholars and authors and public intellectuals who were thinking seriously about peace. They were thinking very often about what would come after. They could see the slide to war, and they were wondering if there is to be a reconstruction. Would there be a reconstruction of some sort of international peace order, some sort of international security order? So I think a round table with the title, What is Peace, is extremely timely for this period. The question is, do we actually need a huge conflagration to think seriously about what peace might look like in the future, what the peace architecture might look like in the future? And I'm very conscious that I'm saying this in a country that has agreed to join NATO, which, let's face it, is not a peace organization. It is a militarized nuclear armed security organization. And I think that speaks to something that is happening at the moment, in which the space in which one can speak about peace has closed over in the past few months. And amongst the very, very many casualties of the war in and on Ukraine is this space to speak seriously about peace without being shouted down by those who want to talk about security and who want to talk seriously about the relationship, the very proper relationship and relationships there should be between peace and security. So moving on to what is peace, clearly there's massive variance in understandings of that. And that's bad for certainty. It's not great for analytical clarity. But actually it feels good, because to me, this huge variance in what we mean about peace feels honest, it feels authentic. Someone mentioned earlier on the messiness of peace. And I think as scholars and practitioners, what we've been trying to do over the past few decades is to live with this messiness and actually co-create this messiness. And to the extent that I understand it, and I stress my understanding is limited, I've learned a great deal from quantum mechanics, because over the past couple of decades, scholars from quantum mechanics have been challenging the classical laws of physics. And I wonder, do we have to challenge the classical laws of peace, or peace and conflict? So physicists have been challenging the certainty and the linearity of many of the laws of physics. They recognize that measurement is interference. They accept dual and contradictory states. Schrodinger's cat, the cat that is simultaneously dead and alive. And that's very helpful for us, I think, when we try to conceive of situations of peace in war and war in peace. Situations like a luxury resort in Israel, a mere 7 kilometers from Gaza. In a single gaze, analytically, how do we understand these seemingly contradictory states? And I think one great lesson that the study of quantum mechanics has for us is that it points to the commonality of anomalies. And it says there are so many anomalies in the classical laws of physics, that we can actually question those classical laws. So maybe this is a time for us to question those. And I think we're doing that in a way because, you know, if I think about the outputs from many of the people in this room, it is about reconciling the top down and the bottom up, the official and the unofficial, the informal, the formal, the aggregated, the disaggregated. And to finish on a high note, in days in which it can be quite easy to become depressed, actually, if we think about our scholarly activity, we should celebrate the fact that we have this multi and inter and transdisciplinary approach, that in this room we approach the same thing through complexity studies, through hybridity, circuitry, agonism, the everyday, post-colonial and feminist lenses, rational choice approaches, quantitative approaches. I think all of this is incredibly helpful and to be celebrated. But what we have to do is to get all of those approaches to talk to one another so that we have not only varieties of peace, but varieties of peace research that aren't siloed. Paul mentioned letting 1,000 approaches to peace bloom, which is a lovely idea. And I think the trick is to get those 1,000 to have a conversation. And that's something, sadly, that I don't think we're quite there yet. And maybe it's something that we could discuss over the next couple of days.
Thank you very much, Roger. Yes, I think that we are trying to do that right now, to have this conversation across different approaches and notions of what peace is. So I will let each of you respond if you have something that you want to comment on the other interventions. So I'll ask Tarja, do you want to say something now?
Yeah. Yes, please. Somewhat Roger just said resonates what I was trying to say as well, namely that some parts of the feminist new materialism derives from quantum physics. And it is interesting because it's exactly do what you said, it kind of shatters the boundaries and the borders and the binaries we thought there are, and this binary between human and non-human is one of those binaries. And at the level of quantum physics, it's kind of or deriving from quantum physics. It's relevant to argue that matter can have agency, and that is entangled with human agency in several situations. So that resonates very nicely what I try to say.
Thank you very much. Paul, do you want to add something?
Not now.
Not now? No? Peter?
Yeah, thank you. I think this is a great panel and there's so many things to think about and try to be constructive around. So Tarja's notion, I think, is really important. And I'm trying to think what are the possible ways forward, the solutions. And the best approach I've seen so far is to say that rivers also have an identity, for instance. So there is a holy river in New Zealand that has its own representative who is there to defend the rights of this river, primarily from the aspect of the river itself, of course, but also the people living along the river, which often is the Maori. Now you give them the rights and you have some who is representing them. And I think that's an approach one could use for a number of these non-human entities, so to say, but they are still part of the human society. And you in some way transform them into human actors and give them agency. I think that's very interesting. And as peace researchers, these are the kind of things we should definitely be very much concerned about. And I would love to see such an approach for the rivers you mentioned in Ukraine. What would that look like? And who could be the spokesperson for this? So I think that helps us to open up. But there are several other things, but let me stop there.
Yes, thank you very much. Yeah, so one thing that has come up is whose piece is it? And I think that speaks to all of the contributions here. And I think, and I'm also wondering about, Paul, I agree with you that it is somewhat problematic that peace, and it's difficult for all of us, I think. When we try to focus on peace, we still end up with talking about conflicts. It's really difficult because you are so used to thinking about peace as the absence of war that when you talk about peace, you often end up talking about war and how to avoid war. And we tend to forget about that peace is also something more beyond the absence of war. And so I really like this idea of trying to go back and see, what would it be like if we tried to redo this whole process? But where we are now, I think it's difficult for many of us. We try to formulate more like positive things that can be added rather than reduced. But it's very often, there are so many peace concepts around, which in a way, I think it's positive because it makes us engage, but it also creates a lot of confusion. And a lot of the peace concepts are defining like imperfect peace. So you add an adjective and then you make it like an imperfect peace rather than. So what do you say about this, these different concepts? Some are more normative, some are more explanatory. Is there something you want to reflect on?
I've been puzzling for the last hour or something on whether peace is something more about the process or is it an outcome? And there's going to be conflict, there's going to be contestation, there's going to be disagreements. I will probably use a word I never use and tell my students never to use, but they're inevitable, right? So part of, I think, peace, there's an element of how they're managed and things like that. And so I hear some of that now about how disagreements are managed without violence or in other ways that produce productive ways of resolving or managing them. In other parts, I've heard people talk more about peace as outcomes, as states of existence, depending on whatever kind of dimension you want. So inequality, lack of inequality, something else like that. That's more of an outcome and not a process. And so I haven't quite figured out where process and outcomes are clearly connected, but where are they part of the defining characteristics of peace?
Mm-hmm. Yes, since peace is, I think that peace is both a process and an outcome. And it's like when you try to capture it, it's like you draw a painting of a running horse. You can't really, you can capture a certain moment and then you can say, okay, here's what peace looks like now. But then a few seconds later, it has a different shape.
Well, but outcomes clearly have a normative element too, because you're defining the peace as some type of desired end state or what happens. And people can disagree about what those outcomes are. Mm. Processes don't necessarily have to, they can have a normative value, but they don't necessarily have to. They can exist, I think, without certain preferences. If you define the process as producing the right kind of outcome, I'm getting a little bit too abstract, but that's the kind of thing. There are those in some national capitals and some unnamed think tanks who look at the process of using overwhelming military force to produce certain kinds of outcomes, right? And I think there's at least an amoral character to that, but they're producing the same end states or outcomes that others who find that abhorrent would support.
Mm-hmm. Yes, now we have two. yeah, Peter first.
Paul, as you brought in Galtung here, his book, one of his books is called Peace through Peaceful Means. So that's the whole idea, that both these things are created at the same time. And I think there is even data on this by Erika Shenovich, studies that show that democratically made changes also provide democracies that are more stable, which is interesting. So the means and the outcome really reflect on each other in some important way. But what I think we are really facing now is sort of an agenda shift. It is like the Cold War that was, so to say, solved. We could put that behind ourselves, and then we could concentrate more on local conflicts, try to do peace building there. The energy that was used to deal with the Cold War was, so to say, taken over by these issues of peace building and how that is really working out. And it is, as we have not finished that, and then on top of that, we now get sort of a return to this, as Roger said, realism again. It is like the agenda suddenly is getting terribly full and we are a little too few. And I think we need to have more people involved in various milieus dealing with all these different issues that belong to peace. So the peace agenda, so to say, has enlarged. It keeps shrinking and enlarging, and now we are in a phase where it is enlarged tremendously, and that shouldn't really make us hesitant. On the contrary, it should really be something that stimulates us more for action and for more types of research.
Roger?
I think it's legitimate to ask how we can study peace on its own. And it is worth unpacking peace. It is worth seeing what its constituent parts and drivers are. But if we accept that peace is relational, and just about every one of the presentations in the first session said peace is relational, well, it's relational to other things, including war or conflict or not peace or situations that are suboptimal. So I don't have a problem with looking at peace and conflict together. And in fact, I ram the two together into this crime against the English language and use the term peace and conflict, all one word. Because I think human life from the earliest days has always involved some form of jeopardy, some forms of injustice. So if we accept that peace is relational, is networked, and is part of complex systems, then I think it's logical to see peace and conflict at least sharing the same space at times. That's not to prevent us from trying to theoretically disaggregate them, unpack them, etc.
Thank you. Tarja?
Yeah, short note about terminology. Yes, indeed, we use terms like war and conflict, but on the other hand, I think at the kind of in the Scandinavian or Nordic tradition of peace research, in the very beginning, people started to talk about violence, and it might be worth speaking about varieties of violence, and then kind of think peace in relation to that as well. And then issues of injustice or inequality would enter. And I think particularly feminist scholarship in peace research has pointed to that direction, that it would be extremely important to look at something which they call continuums of violence and how to tackle those different varieties of violence.
Yes, it really gives rise to a lot of thoughts, I think, and I'm sure that we have a lot of questions and comments from the audience as well. And I would like to ask also the digital participants that if you have any questions and comments, please raise your hand or write a comment in the chat function. Yes, but otherwise I'll open up. Okay, so now we have... Okay. David first.
Yeah, thanks.
Sorry. You have to wait for the microphone so everyone can hear you.
Thanks. Yeah, I really enjoyed that discussion. Very stimulating. I wanted to just sort of interrogate Peter's point a little bit on whether we're at an agenda shifting moment and whether complexity is the right way to look at it. I mean, I know far less about quantum physics, I think, than even you do. So, does the return of interstate conflict actually return us to a much simpler conceptualization of war and peace? On the 23rd of February, there were not tanks crossing the border into Ukraine. On the 24th, there were. This was in some ways a very simple decision, essentially by one man sitting in the Kremlin, to send a military across the border. And you move from a state of non-war, Donbass to one side, to full-scale war in Ukraine. Doesn't that change our thinking a little bit about positive and negative peace? Doesn't negative peace now come back in the interstate context as something actually much more important? And doesn't it move us away a little bit from this idea of sort of continuum of violence and indeed the whole Scandinavian approach that was mentioned to peace to, dare I say it, rather more old-fashioned and rather realist understanding of what peace is and what war is?
So please, Annick Wibben.
Okay. Yes, thank you. Thank you for these interventions. I have a couple of comments. I'll start with sort of my reactions to you, Paul, the sort of questions you're raising. Whose perspective? Some people have been thinking about that for a while, and that links to what Tarja was talking about just now. I mean, the question that I guess also came up earlier today, the various constituents, often women are mentioned as sort of something to be included, or someone to be included as a sort of minority or something like that, when of course we're not. And I guess what I'm reacting to a little bit is like, what is this peace research that is being described here? Because it's maybe not the one that I know or encounter or engage with. So I would urge maybe to, rather than reinvent the wheel, right? Look at, sort of thinking all new about these questions of negative and positive peace, et cetera, maybe look sort of also, not just, but also into the direction of feminist work, for example, on the continuums of violence, which have long questioned, for example, the sort of peace-war distinction, the question of whether, it makes sense to talk about peace and conflict as something different, because I think it produces, again, the language question is important, it produces sort of certain distinctions that are not actually productive. It sort of sets up peace in such a way that it becomes this utopia, and in some way, of course, it should be. I have written about that as well. I also want to caution on this sort of idea that somehow Ukraine, or what is happening in Ukraine, so fundamentally challenges peace studies. Because I think as much as you could identify certain things, and that's important, it also reproduces an incredible Eurocentrism that I have a real problem with. And then finally, sorry, taking a whole round approach here, quantum physics. Okay, not only has it been around for a really long time, there have been within social sciences, humanities, human sciences, long traditions that have said exactly the same thing. And so actually, is it us learning from the physicists, or is it them learning from us? And then last point, maybe in direction of Tarja. I mean, I think I always love your interventions, but I'm also wondering, do we need feminist new materialisms, or are, you know, native cosmologies just as good? And I'm thinking here particularly, you mentioned the question of water, you know, the sort of Dakota protest around water. Water is life, our bodies being made up of, you know, water, the sort of, we come from water, we return to water. Why do we need, you know, sort of feminist new materialisms via quantum physics, via, like, why are we always forgetting or not engaging the work that is already there elsewhere? So, a few provocations. Passing on.
There was Marie-Joëlle on the list.
All right, thank you very much. It's really fascinating conversation and stimulating dialogue here. And I kind of relate, you know, I wanted to, you know, chime in what Roger said, that peace is relational to war, you know, if we are to define peace in terms of the relation. But my point, you know, or the comment that I want to pass here, and maybe, you know, want to listen from your point of view is, we are thinking about war when we have abundance of peace. And we are thinking about peace when we have abundance of war. How do we see this? You know, how we understand? Right? And basically, you know, the way we research these issues is kind of contradictory, right? In a way, how we reconcile this? Why we, you know, take the field, you know, and advance, you know, all the time, no matter what happens. Like, you know, always talk about peace. Always talk about war in terms of relation to each other.
Thank you for three very good interventions. I think we will let the panel respond first, and then we'll gather some more comments. So who wants to go first? Roger.
David, I think your question, I can't wait to use it as an essay question for my students next year. Did the world become simpler with the invasion of Ukraine? I think it's a great question. And in one way, yes, of course, it did. You know, it was back to heavy metal conflict in a way, something that we hadn't seen in Europe in a while. Does it therefore demand simpler conceptualization to realism? And in one way, yes, but in another way, I think, isn't that just too convenient? And I can think of lots of people, you know, of elites, you know, ranging from Putin to NATO leaders thinking, yes, you know, you people, you pesky citizens, this is nothing to do with you. But actually, I see the appalling scenes from Ukraine and see people and pets and gardens and houses and, you know, the fullness of life. I see conflict through a sociological and a feminist lens and many others. And when we think about reconstruction, then we have to think about the local and the everyday. And I think, you know, in a weird sort of way, we shouldn't let the conceptualization of the war in and on Ukraine be stolen by the realists. And also, you know, this echoes the very good point made at the back of the room, and that is Ukraine has refixed our eyes, reinforced this European lens. Yemen hasn't gone away, climate change hasn't gone away, etc., etc. The really good question about quantum mechanics, which was an extremely polite way of rephrasing the so what question. So I congratulate you on that. Yes, you're absolutely right. The late 19th century, early 20th century classical social scientists have said much of this before. And then the social sciences have reinvented the wheel about 3-4 times since then. But I think the important point that I would make is if we compare the study of peace and conflict with the study of physics, there really has been, and it's not a term I would use a lot, there has been a paradigm shift in physics. I'm not quite sure that we have had one. So I think that is the difference. Quick answer to Madhav, how do we reconcile all of these different approaches? I think we are doing so simply by multiple approaches, multiple disciplinary and epistemological approaches, and furthering these conversations. We're never going to reconcile it like a neat set of accounts. You know, the auditors would scream if they saw these accounts. They're going to be messy, but as long as we're tolerant of each other's approaches, I think that's the optimal situation.
Yeah, thank you. And now I have Peter, I think, and then Tarja, and then Paul.
Yeah, thank you for great questions. And I'd like to go back to the same that Roger and David's question about did the world become simpler? Of course not. It became even more complicated. So for me, when I look at the data, the world changes around 2014. It happens to be when the Crimea is occupied, but it is also when ISIS turns up and becomes important. And then from there on, things become increasingly complex. Trump is elected 2016, Brexit, up till today, when the Supreme Court in the US is going to decide something which will be a throwback by decades in the US for women. So it's like it has been brewing for a long period of time that things are going the other way. And it means that we have, at the same time, we have the issues of the nuclear weapons. We have at the same time the democracy issue, what is happening to that, the peace building ambitions, the environmental issues, the question of what to do about sexual violence. All of those things remain. And when you look at Ukraine, as Tarja made clear, all of these things happen at the same time in the same territory. So the world is really getting more complex. And that's why I think it's not becoming simpler. That would be wrong if we thought so. No, we need to live with this entire complexity. And so that's why my conclusion is we just need to be more peace researchers. We were too few in 2014. We need to be much better prepared for the coming decade. And we have wonderful students, so I'm hopeful.
Yeah, thank you. Tarja.
Yeah, thank you. Good questions. And is my former student, so there's an interesting relational issue here as well. So about kind of quantum physics and indigenous cosmologies. And this leads to a more general question about knowledge production. I don't dare to speak about indigenous cosmologies because I think it raises the issues whose voice I'm kind of talking about. Am I kind of once again trying to represent something which I'm not part of? So this is a feminist question as well. So unless I would be in the business of co-production of knowledge, I would not dare to go there too much. I acknowledge that, but for me it's easier to go to that Western tradition and say that, well, fair enough, that's my tradition.
Thank you. And then Paul.
Okay, I'll use the seat at the front of the table not to respond to the good critiques of what I said, but from what others said. How's that? There seems to be an assumption here at the front and the audience that Ukraine really is a turning point, a critical juncture, or something else like that. Why do you think that? One could easily look from a broader view and see the last 75 years, the number of territorial aggressions has declined. even those that have occurred have not generally been recognized. Those who've done it have paid a certain kind of price. I mean, is it too early? I mean, it's easy to look at sort of one event and say the whole world has kind of changed. Has it really? Aren't the kind of norms and things that Peter was alluding to still fairly robust? And that maybe when we're sitting here, if I'm still around in 30 or 40 years, we might be able to look back and say, yeah, they really were, you were wrong, Paul. But I think maybe, I don't know the answer, but I'm a little concerned that everyone seems to be jumping to the conclusion that this is a watershed moment. I'm not sure.
Okay, thank you. A question to all of us. You can think about that. I have two persons on the list, but I want to read some questions from the chat first. The first one is from Elaine Prattley to Tarja. Could you speak to how you see mundane peace as departing from traditional feminist understandings of peace as embodied and the culture of peace? And then we have a second question from Enrique Garbino, and that is a question to the whole panel. So Enrique's question relates to the intentionality in negative peace. For example, the absence of violence in war might occur due to several contextual factors, such as heavy snowfall, lack of ammunition, no access to targets, or effective deterrence from the opponent. So would then a better measure and concept for negative peace be restraint or restrained, being the genuine self-limitation on the use of violence? If so, how to measure restraint? And before that, how to conceptualize restraint? Let me see if that is the end. That was the end. Thank you. So remember those questions, and then I will give the floor to Erin McCandless.
Thanks, everyone. Great panel, provocative. It's forcing me to think in different ways. So these questions are for any one of you to reflect on. The first one relates to, Tanya's suggestion earlier that positive, we need to move away from the binary of positive and negative peace. But I'm sort of wondering, do they need to be binaries? Can they be nested, right? Can we think of varieties of positive peace, for example, or varieties of negative peace? Can negative peace be a constituent part of positive peace? And also I thought, the notion of perpetual peace or ongoing peace building does not necessarily need to also be in conflict with positive peace or negative peace. Well, positive peace, let's say positive peace. And then coming back to the means and ends, I think this is it's a very challenging question. I thought we'd won this debate in peace studies, but it seems to keep coming back. And I know, as I said earlier, I struggled with it earlier with a paper on social cohesion, which I also think is means and ends. And yet I have struggled in conversation with positivists who wouldn't really accept that that's feasible, or maybe I'm just not aware of positivists who could believe it. So I'd love, maybe Paul, you can share your thoughts on that. But I'm also wondering about methodological models for studying the relationship of means and ends. It's quite tricky, and I struggled with that and was searching for help on how to do that. And then I think it's also worth us reflecting on when and how is violence justified. I'd love to hear from you. Do you think it's justified ever? Certainly just war theory tried to, wrestle with this. In my own PhD, I had Sam Moyo, a land, scholar in Zimbabwe, as my supervisor, and he believed strongly that some violence was acceptable given the overwhelming nature of structural violence towards, the masses in Zimbabwe who did not have land, did not have access to land or equal access or fair access and so forth. So yeah, I think it's an ongoing question that we have to grapple with, and it's coming up more and more, especially as we look at the resistance movements around the world around inequality, Black Lives Matter, racial justice, and so forth. Do we accept that violence or, certain kinds of violence are justified as peace researchers. And lastly, I'm just wondering, does Varieties of Peace suggest a move towards relativism and away from us having a normative position on peace? And how do we feel about that? Thank you.
Thank you, Erin. And now we have Angelica, that guy first, and then Lisa.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this very interesting panel. For me, the issue of positionality is really important, where you stand to look at these issues. And for me, as a Southern-based scholar, of course, I ask myself what Paul just answered, which is to what extent Ukraine is a watershed moment. I tend to believe it is not. I believe that what you described, Peter and Marafon, in your research was to be seen all the time. I mean, there were other conflicts with the same sort of aspirations, or are other conflicts with the same sort of aspirations going on. So what we are seeing in Ukraine now, I think, is likely to happen more, and maybe has been happening, but we were just not seeing it because it didn't happen in the heart of Europe. So my I guess concrete concern is very geopolitical. To what extent will this have an effect, not on our research necessarily, but on funding, on IR departments, on what kind of research questions are going to be privileged? And that will, of course, again, from my perspective as a Southern-based scholar in Colombia, affect the kind of studies on the kind of violence that we've been dealing with so far.
But I will have a lot of questions to answer with the online ones as well. Thanks all for great interventions. I just have a couple of questions, and one is for Tarja, because I really like the way that you talk about slow violence and how we can understand different forms of violence and also peace, and try to incorporate like human and maybe also non-human perspectives. But one thing that I wonder, and it was evident when Peter talked about the river having a representative, I wonder if because I've some years back now read Jane Bennett and Vibrant Matter and all of those kind of new materialism works, and I wasn't convinced. So sometimes I wonder, do we need a new ontology, or do we need an epistemology that's not anthropocentric? So I would like you to reflect a little bit on that, because I've been struggling with it myself and I'm not convinced, as I said. And Roger, I really enjoyed the quantum physics discussion. And I agree with you. I think it's good that we have a rich discipline. I think it would be very scary if we had a large peace paradigm with peace researchers all over the world having the same definitions and same kind of perspectives on things. Because then what if things change? Then we have nothing, right? So I think it's an indication of a richness of a discipline that we actually do have all these different approaches. But I wonder if we need quantum mechanics to justify contextualized and more subjectivist understandings of peace. So in a way, it seems like we need that to tell maybe realists that, look, there are different perspectives out there. But I mean, most of us in the room, we know that already. So I'm just wondering who we need this quantum physics argument kind of against. You look perplexed.
Didn't you ask me exactly the same question when I presented
almost
in Lund?
Yes, I want to bring it up.
Exactly the same question. Weren't you listening?
Maybe you didn't fully satisfy my my curiosity.
Well, thank you very much. So now we have a lot of questions and comments, and I will give the panel a last couple of words, or the opportunity to respond to some of these comments. So you have about 3 minutes each at the most, or something like that, before this whole session actually ends.
Okay, Peter goes first.
Yes, if you're willing to.
I always do as Paul says. Lots of really good comments. And one is, of course, how big an event is this that goes on in Ukraine? And I think we shouldn't underestimate how powerful this is, what is appearing here, both because we see it in media in a way, but also because it really exposes a lot of propaganda, how lies are surviving. We're really learning how you can get away with the lie, and how you can talk to Russian colleagues here, talking to their parents back in Moscow, for instance. It's in a sense fascinating, but at the same time rather dramatic how important, how clearly possible it is to manipulate people. And we should of course watch out for being manipulated ourselves. So I think in that sense it has a tremendous impact. And it's of course true, in the UCP data, this is just 1 out of 50 armed conflicts. And indeed many of those, as I mentioned, deal with territorial issues. So it's not the only one. But I think this one, by having a major power involved in such a brutal warfare, makes those norms pulverized for each bomb that they drop in a way which has not been the case with others. So the difference here is that it is a big power that is involved. The United States have done similar things, of course, but it hasn't challenged that particular norm about territorial borders that is being questioned right now. So I think it has a tremendous impact. If Russia wins, I think the next thing will be a war between China and Taiwan, etc. So it has, excuse me, it does have an impact. The comment, I think, Paul, you have to take over. The issue I would like to comment on was the question about restraint, which I thought was really very interesting, to define peace in terms of restraint that you can have, which I think is probably a rather useful way to go. For instance, the police, how is the police controlled? What kind of restraints does it have in acting internally? I think that's a key issue in Sweden and United States, elsewhere. Or the military, what kind of restraints are there? And how do you maintain such restraints in the use of lethal violence? It seemed to me that would be a quite valuable way to pursue on that particular question. Sure enough, there are many other issues like the violence. Is it justified, as Erin asked? I've always thought, at least of the criteria, that it should be the last resort. And when I would look at the conflict, I would really ask, have you tried everything else before? And if I do that test, again, looking at Russia, if I do that test with Putin's article on the 12th of July, 2021, and see what happens after that, there is no resort to diplomacy. There is no attempt even to negotiate the smallest things. That is not last resort. So in that sense, it would not be justified. It would not meet that kind of criteria. But I think all those criteria are really very interesting. And of course, they go back to religious thinking and so on, but they're also part of the UN Charter. So indeed, you have raised a whole set of questions, and that's why we need to go on at least until midnight, but maybe we shouldn't.
Yeah, thank you. Paul.
Now it's Paul.
If I had, I couldn't even do it in an hour. There were so many kind of good questions, most of which I agreed with, or the things that just puzzle the heck out of me. And that's a good thing. But let me go back to sort of some of the big issues, which was something that Roger said, and the last thing that Lisa said. And if you put those together, I still kind of wonder where to go. Roger's saying we need to diversity, we've got diversity, we need to have more conversations to learn from each other. And Lisa said diversity is good. Is diversity good if no one talks to each other? And I wonder, you sort of imply, Lisa, that maybe things change and something else comes in fashion and starts to match whatever the current thing is in the headlines. It's good because we have somebody to talk about it. But I was thinking something more a little intellectually of sharing of ideas and perspectives. And I've been kind of puzzling over this as I've been trying to write some papers with Oliver Richman, who has a very different perspective in epistemology than I do. From this, and I wonder, and all I'll say is, because I won't only get 3 minutes, not 15, is that I find that those conversations are difficult. The bridges are difficult to build in a context where scholars publish in different journals, use different languages, disagree on fundamental epistemological kinds of assumptions that are out there. And I don't believe that policymakers are any less insular. They may be worse than scholars on that. And so I haven't kind of figured out how that happens. It's nice to be in a diverse kind of group like that. There are ideas I will walk away with that I never would, but I'm not convinced those bridges can be built.
Okay, Tarja.
Yeah, I would like to address Lisa's question about epistemologies and ontology. I think, yes, you're right. It does not make kind of sense to list different ontologies of environment or environmental peace building or relations between human and non-human. I think you're right there. And it's kind of, we have to take a step forward to go from there to have a kind of solid research designs, how to study this. And eventually, I'm sure this will influence also practices. I think someone said, was it Tanya in the morning session, that kind of theorizing and conceptualizing affects practices. So some people are taking that up and preaching that to the level of practices as well. But we have very little examples of kind of studies who do follow, who kind of try to work with these type of epistemologies and ontologies. And yes, well, that's my point. We have very little examples of that. So I think it's time to do that in peace research as well, to go from level of ontology to the level of epistemology, and then to the level of methodological thinking, and then case study kind of designs.
Erin asked, is violence ever justified? And I think it's pretty easy to move into the abstract and talk about one state invading the other. Let's face it, we don't control armies. So, you know, it's a nice seminar room exercise. But if we think about this question in relation to, well, what do we mean by violence? And if we think about it, not in terms of words and justification, but in terms of action, then by our everyday actions, if we're a traveler, if we're a consumer, if we watch the Olympics or the World Cup, we justify violence in our everyday life. It is part of modernity. Lisa, I'm happy to fail to answer the question that I failed to answer a couple of months ago. You asked, do we need quantum physics to understand complexity? The first thing I would say is, I think, given the advances by realists, we actually do need to understand the complex nature of peace and conflict. Do we need quantum mechanics to do that? No, we don't. Do we need anthropology to do that? No, we don't. Do we need history? Do we need many other disciplines? Do we need Marxism or political economy or feminism? No, we don't. But it would be a very, very dull discipline indeed without us actually going and reading outside of our comfort zone. I think that's exactly what I said a few months ago. Only I probably wasn't as irritated. Next time I'll be furious.
Well, thank you so much for this lively discussion and comments both from our digital participants on the floor here. So, well, what is the conclusion? There's no consensus really on what peace is. And I don't think that we should strive for consensus either. But I do think that we should engage in conversations across different approaches and try to understand each other's perspectives. And also, when we talk about peace, just define what you mean. I think that goes a long way. I think so. I'm very glad for this roundtable, and I think that yes, we should continue to talk about what peace is. I think that's essential. So I would like to give a big thank you to the panelists with a round of applause. Okay, so